Welcome to Edge of the Earth, written by Doug Richardson, narrated by R.K. Marks, copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. The Story of Geographical Discovery. Introduction. How did the peoples living around the Mediterranean Sea become aware of the other parts of the world? For the past 5,000 or 6,000 years, every part of the earth has been inhabited by humans, while Europeans have been accumulating knowledge. During this time, the inhabitants of each part were acquainted with their particular part of the world. The Kamtchatkans knew Kamtchatka, the Greenlanders knew Greenland, and the various tribes of North American Indians knew the part of America over which they wandered. Often these natives not only knew their own country, but could express their knowledge in maps of remarkable accuracy. Cortés traveled over 1,000 miles through Central America, guided only by a calico map of a local cacique. An Eskimo named Kaliheri drew a map of the coast between Smith Channel and Cape York from his own knowledge, which varied only in minute details from the Admiralty chart. A native of Tahiti, named Tupaya, drew a map of the Pacific for Cook, extending over 45 degrees of longitude, giving the relative size and position of the main islands over that huge tract of ocean. Almost all geographical discoveries by Europeans have been brought about by employing guides who knew the country which their European masters wished to discover. The history of geographical discovery is the gradual bringing to the knowledge of the nations of civilization surrounding the Mediterranean Sea the vast tracts of land extending in all directions from it. There are mainly two divisions of this history, the discovery of the Old World and that of the New, including Australia under the latter term. Though we speak of geographical discovery, we are thinking of the discovery of new tribes of people. It is only quite recently that people have sought knowledge about lands apart from the people who inhabit them. One might almost say that the history of geographical discovery, properly so called, begins with Captain Cook, whose voyages were motivated purely by scientific curiosity. Centuries ago, men sought to understand one another for two main reasons: to conquer or to trade. These motives often intertwined, resulting in the European partition of Africa, which was a remarkable event of the late 19th century. Men like Speke, Burton, Livingstone, and Stanley explored the African interior out of a love for adventure and knowledge. Later, great chartered trading companies emerged, followed by governments that assumed responsibility for the territories they discovered. The history of geographical discovery is primarily a history of conquest. We aim to provide a brief history of the ancient world from the perspective of how it became known. To whom did it become known, you may ask? We must first answer that question. We could start with the earliest geographical work known to us, the 10th chapter of Genesis, and trace how the rest of the world became known to the Israelites when they became part of the Roman Empire. However, in history, all roads lead to Rome or away from it. Therefore, it is more useful to take Rome as our center point. Rome inherited the knowledge of the earth and man from earlier empires that spread it through conquest long before Rome was of importance. Even when the Romans were the masters of this vast inheritance, they lacked the ability to record the geographical knowledge they acquired. It was a Greek named Ptolemy, a professor at the great University of Alexandria, who recorded the ancient world's knowledge of the earth. We owe our understanding of how much the ancient world knew of the earth to him. It is convenient to determine this first before sketching the course of historical events that led to the knowledge Ptolemy recorded. In the Middle Ages, much of the knowledge that was once known was lost, and we must now recount how imagination and theory replaced it. The Arabs were the true inheritors of Greek science during that time, and they were responsible for the few additions to geographical knowledge, except for the knowledge brought by commercial travelers and pilgrims who had a more intimate knowledge of Asia. The discovery of America marked the beginning of a new era in modern history and geography. In the 500 years since then, civilized man has discovered more than twice as much of the inhabited globe than in the preceding 4,000 years. As a result, with the exception of a few areas in Africa, South America, and around the poles, man now has a rough idea of the physical resources of the world he inhabits, and the history of geographical discovery is practically complete, except for minor details. This history is not only interesting as a record of war and adventure, but it also shows the successive stages by which modern men have become what they are today. The longest-known countries and peoples have had the most profound influence in shaping the civilized character. Moreover, the practical usefulness of this study cannot be overstated. The way in which the world has been discovered now determines the world's history. The great problems of the 20th century are directly related to the discoveries of America, Africa, and Australia. Englishmen will have the most to say and do in all of these problems, and therefore the history of geographical discovery is of immediate and immense interest to the Western world. Chapter 1. The World as Known to the Ancients. In order to understand how the ancients came to know the world as they did during the height of the Roman Empire, it is important to first understand the progression of their knowledge. The Greeks were the ones who first introduced us to ancient views on the subject, as is often the case with organized knowledge. While they may have learned some things from the Phoenicians, who were the great traders and sailors of antiquity, and who traveled along the Mediterranean coast and even ventured to the British Isles for tin found in Cornwall, the Phoenicians kept their geographical knowledge to themselves as a trade secret. The earliest glimpse we have of the Greeks' understanding of the shape and inhabitants of the earth comes from the works of Homer. While he showed an intimate knowledge of northern Greece and the western coasts of Asia Minor, as well as some familiarity with Egypt, Cyprus, and Sicily, the rest of the eastern Mediterranean was only vaguely conceived by him. When he did not know something, he imagined it, and some of his imaginings have had a significant impact on the progress of geographical knowledge. For example, he conceived of the world as a sort of flat shield, with an extremely wide river surrounding it, known as ocean. The center of this shield was at Delphi, which was regarded as the navel of the inhabited world. According to Hesiod, who lived not long after Homer, there were people known as the Hyperboreani in the far north, who dwelt at the back of the north wind, while a corresponding place in the south was taken by the Abyssinians. All of these conceptions had a significant influence on people's views of the world up to relatively recent times. Homer also mentioned the pygmies as living in Africa, which were regarded as fabulous until they were rediscovered by Dr. Schweinfurth and Mr. Stanley in our own time. From the Babylonians, the Greeks likely acquired the notion of an encompassing ocean. The people of Mesopotamia could reach the ocean in almost any direction they journeyed, whether it be the Caspian, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, or the Persian Gulf. Consequently, the oldest known map of the world, which accompanies a cuneiform inscription, depicts the Mesopotamian plain with the Euphrates coursing through it, and the whole surrounded by two concentric circles called briny waters. Beyond these circles are 7 separate islets, possibly representing the 7 zones or climates into which the Babylonians divided the world, though they later reverted to the standard 4 cardinal points. What was approximately true of Babylonia did not correspond to Greece's geographical position, so it is likely that they first obtained their ideas of the surrounding ocean from the Babylonians. After the era of Homer and Hesiod, the Greeks' first significant expansion of knowledge about the world occurred through the extensive colonization they carried out around the eastern Mediterranean. Even today, the inhabitants of the southern part of Italy speak a Greek dialect due to the broad range of Greek colonies in that country, which was once known as Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. Marseille, another Greek colony, 600 BC, in turn dispatched other colonies along the Gulf of Lion. In the east, Greek cities dotted the coast of the Black Sea, one of which, Byzantium, was destined to be of world historic significance. Similarly, in North Africa and among the Aegean Sea islands, the Greeks colonized throughout the 6th and 5th centuries BC, and in almost every instance, communication was maintained between the colonies and the motherland. Now the Greeks' curiosity was the one attribute that made them so prominent in world history, and it was natural for them to want to know and document the vast amount of information brought to the Greek mainland from the countless Greek colonies. But to record geographical knowledge, the first thing required is a map, and thus it was a Greek philosopher named Anaximander of Miletus, from the 6th century BC, to whom we owe the invention of map drawing. To create a map of one's own country, little astronomical knowledge is required. Natives have the ability to draw such maps. However, describing the relative positions of countries divided by seas is not an easy task. An Athenian would have a general idea that Byzantium, now called Constantinople, was somewhat to the east and north of him, as he would have to sail towards the rising sun to get there, and the climate would get colder as he approached. Similarly, he might guess that Marseille was somewhere to the west and north of him, But how could he determine the relative position of Marseille and Byzantium to one another? Was Marseille more northerly than Byzantium? Was it far away from that city? Although it took longer to get to Marseille, the voyage was winding and might bring the vessel relatively close to Byzantium, even though there might not be a direct road between the two cities. There was a rough way of determining how far north a place stood. A traveller could observe that as he moved towards the north, the pole star rose higher up in the heavens. The angle formed by a stick pointing to the pole star in relation to one held horizontally could determine how much higher it rose. If a piece of metal or wood was cut out to fill up the enclosed angle instead of using two sticks, the earliest form of the sundial, known as the gnomon, was created. The shape of the gnomon could determine the latitude of a place. Therefore, it is not surprising that the invention of the gnomon is attributed to Anaximander. Without some such instrument, it would have been impossible for him to have made any map worthy of the name. However, it is probable that Anaximander did not invent the gnomon, but introduced it. Herodotus expressly states that this instrument was derived from the Babylonians, who were the earliest astronomers known. A curious point confirms this, for the measurement of angles is by degrees, and degrees are divided into 60 seconds, just as minutes are. This division into 60 is certainly derived from Babylonia in the case of time measurement, and is therefore of the same origin as the measurement of angles. The first map of the world, drawn up by Anaximander, has been lost to time. However, it is widely believed that it served as the foundation for a similar map created by Anaximander's fellow townsman, Hecataeus of Miletus. Hecataeus is credited with writing the first formal geography, though only fragments of his work remain. These fragments reveal that his writing took the form of a periplus, or seaman's guide, detailing the number of days it would take to sail from one point to another and in what direction. Hecataeus organized his subject matter into two books, one covering Europe and the other covering Asia, which included parts of Africa. From the fragments that have survived, scholars have been able to reconstruct a rough outline of Hecataeus's map of the world. It is clear that his map was heavily influenced by the Homeric conception of the surrounding ocean. Hecataeus was familiar with the Mediterranean, Red and Black Seas, as well as the major rivers of the region, including the Danube, Nile, Euphrates, Tigris, and Indus. The next major figure in the history of Greek geography was Herodotus of Halicarnassus. Often referred to as the father of history, he could just as easily be called the father of geography. Herodotus traveled extensively throughout Egypt, Babylonia, Persia, and the Black Sea region. He was also familiar with Greece and spent his later years in southern Italy. Herodotus provided his fellow citizens with accurate and detailed information about the countries he visited, and he diligently collected knowledge about neighboring regions. He provided full details about Scythia, southern Russia, and the satrapies and royal roads of Persia. While his information was as accurate as could be expected for the time, he rarely told fantastical stories. When he did report such stories, he made it clear that they were not to be trusted. The one exception was a tale about giant ants in India that supposedly burrowed out gold dust for their ant hills. 5 young men of the Nasamonians embarked on a journey from southern Libya, located west of the Sudan, and trekked for many days towards the west until they reached a grove of trees. They were then captured by a group of men who were very small in stature, and were led through marshes to a great city of black men who were of the same size. A large river flowed through the city, which Herodotus identified as the Nile. However, based on the journey's indication, it is more likely that it was the Niger, and the Nasamonians had visited Timbuktu. This statement by Herodotus led to the belief that the Upper Nile flowed east and west. After Herodotus, whose history dates back to 444 BC, Xenophon and Alexander's 2 expeditions brought the Greeks familiar knowledge as far as India, leading to a significant increase in knowledge of the western part of Asia. Besides these military expeditions, several mariners' logbooks still exist, which could have added significantly to Greek geography. One of these logbooks tells the story of Carthaginian Admiral Hanno's expedition down the western coast of Africa, as far as Sierra Leone, a voyage that was not undertaken again for 1600 years. Hanno brought back hairy skins from this voyage, which he claimed belonged to men and women he had captured who were known to the natives as gorillas. Another logbook is that of a Greek named Scylax, who provides the sailing distances between nearly all ports on the Mediterranean and Black Seas, and the number of days required to pass from one to another. It would seem that a Greek merchant vessel could cover an average of 50 miles a day. Additionally, one of Alexander's admirals, named Nearchus, learned to carry his ships from the mouth of the Indus to the Arabian Gulf. During ancient times, a Greek sailor by the name of Hippolus discovered the power of the monsoons. By timing his voyages just right, he could sail straight from Arabia to India, without the need to laboriously follow the coasts of Persia and Baluchistan. The Greeks, in recognition of his discovery, named these winds after him. As for information about India itself, the Greeks relied on the account of Megasthenes, an ambassador sent by Seleucus, one of Alexander the Great's generals, to the Indian king of Punjab. Meanwhile, knowledge of the north of Europe was being expanded by the journeys of a man named Pythias, a native of Marseille who lived around the time of Alexander the Great, 333 BC. He was the first civilized person who can be identified as having visited Britain. He sailed along the Bay of Biscay, spent some time in England, which he estimated to be 4,000 miles in circumference, and then continued along the coasts of Belgium and Holland, reaching the mouth of the Elbe. Pythias is most famous in the history of geography for his reference to the island of Thule, which he described as the most northerly point of the inhabited earth, beyond which the sea became thickened and jelly-like. He didn't claim to have visited Thule himself, and his account probably referred to the existence of drift ice near the Shetland Islands. All of this new information was gathered together and made available to the Greek reading public by Eratosthenes, the librarian of Alexandria, 240 to 196 BC, who is considered the founder of scientific geography. He was the first to attempt an accurate measurement of the size of the earth and its inhabited portion. By his time, the scientific minds of Greece had become aware that the earth was a globe, although they believed it was fixed in space at the center of the universe. Some had even guessed the size of the globe, with Aristotle estimating its circumference at 40,000 miles. Eratosthenes, however, attempted a more precise measurement. He compared the length of the shadow cast by the sun at Alexandria and at Siena, near the first cataract of the Nile, which he assumed to be on the same longitude and about 500 miles apart. From observing the difference in the length of shadows, Eratosthenes deduced that the distance between two cities represented 1/50th of the Earth's circumference, which he calculated to be around 25,000 geographical miles. Although the actual circumference is 24,899 English miles, Eratosthenes' approximation was remarkable, considering the limited resources at his disposal. After estimating the size of the Earth, Eratosthenes proceeded to determine the size of the habitable portion, which he believed extended to 3,800 miles north and south of the lands known to him. He also calculated that from the Straits of Gibraltar to the east of India was about 1/3 of the Earth's surface, with the remaining 2/3 covered by the ocean. Eratosthenes prophetically remarked that, if it were not that the vast extent of the Atlantic Sea rendered it impossible, one might almost sail from the coast of Spain to that of India along the same parallel. Columbus attempted to carry out this idea 1,600 years later. Eratosthenes based his calculations on two fundamental lines, similar to our equator and the meridian of Greenwich. The first line stretched from Cape St. Vincent through the Straits of Messina and the island of Rhodes to Issus, Gulf of Iskanderun. For his starting line in reckoning north and south, he used a meridian passing through the first cataract, Alexandria, Rhodes, and Byzantium. The next 200 years after Eratosthenes' death were marked by the expansion of the Roman Empire, which took over the vast possessions previously held by Alexander and his successors and the Carthaginians. The Romans spread into Gaul, Britain, and Germany, and much of the increased knowledge was summarized in the geographical work of Strabo, who wrote it in Greek around 20 BC. From the extra knowledge he gained, he introduced many modifications to the system of Eratosthenes, but he generally kept to his overall conception of the world. He did, however, reject the existence of Thule, which made the world narrower, while recognizing the existence of Ierne, or Ireland, which he believed to be the most northerly part of the habitable world, lying north of Britain. Between the time of Strabo and Ptolemy, who summed up all the knowledge of the ancients about the habitable earth, there was only one significant addition to men's acquaintance with their neighbors, contained in a seaman's manual for the navigation of the Indian Ocean, known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. This provided very full and reasonably accurate accounts of the coasts from Aden to the mouth of the Ganges, though it regarded Ceylon as much larger and more to the south than it really is. However, it also contains an account of the more easterly parts of Asia, Indochina, and China itself, where the silk comes from. This had an important influence on the views of Ptolemy, as we shall see, and indirectly helped long afterwards to the discovery of America. It was left to Ptolemy of Alexandria to sum up for the ancient world all the knowledge that had been accumulating from the time of Eratosthenes to his own day, which we may fix at about 150 AD. He took all the information he could find in the writings of the preceding 400 years and reduced it all to one uniform scale. For it is to him that we owe the invention of the method and the names of latitude and longitude. Previous writers had been content to say that the distance between one point and another was so many days or months of travel, but he reduced all this rough reckoning to so many degrees of latitude and longitude from fixed lines as starting points. But unfortunately, all these reckonings were rough calculations, which are almost invariably beyond the truth, and Ptolemy, though the greatest of ancient astronomers, further distorted his results by assuming that a degree was 50 geographical miles. In his pursuit of knowledge, Ptolemy relied heavily on the information he gathered from his sources. When he read that the distance between two ports was 50 miles, he accepted it as truth. He then assumed that the distance between the two places was equal to a degree of latitude or longitude, depending on the circumstance. This led him to conclude that the breadth of the habitable globe was 12 hours of longitude, or 180 degrees. However, this was nearly one-third larger than the actual distance from Spain to China. As a result, the distance from Spain to China was mistakenly reduced by 60 degrees, or almost 4,000 miles. This error ultimately inspired Columbus to embark on his historic voyage. Ptolemy's errors of calculation could have been less significant if he had used Alexandria as the point of departure for measuring longitude. This would have balanced out the errors he made when measuring westward and eastward. However, he chose the fortunate insule, or Canary Islands, as his starting point. As a result, every degree measured to the east of the Canary Islands was 1/5 too great, since he believed it was only 50 miles in length. Ptolemy's influence on geography was so great that until the mid-19th century, the Canary Islands were still considered the 0 point of the meridians of longitude. Ptolemy's system also departed from the previous assumption that the world was surrounded by the ocean. Instead, he believed that Africa extended an unknown length to the south and connected to an equally unknown continent far to the east, which he called Terra Australis Incognita, or the unknown Southland. This misconception paved the way for Captain Cook's discoveries. In his quest for knowledge, Ptolemy relied heavily on his sources, but his assumptions and errors led to significant misconceptions about the world. Despite his errors, which were partly due to the rough materials he worked with and partly due to scientific caution, Ptolemy's work stands as a great monument to human industry and knowledge. For over 1,500 years, it served as the basis for all geographical knowledge in the Old World, just as his astronomical work was only surpassed by Newton. Ptolemy is therefore a rare authority on two important areas of human knowledge: astronomy and geography. It is unnecessary to delve into the details of Ptolemy's description of the world, but his map shows how close he came to the main outlines of the Mediterranean, northwest Europe, Arabia, and the Black Sea. Beyond these regions, he had to rely on the rough indications and guesses of untutored merchants. However, it is worth noting his method of determining latitude, which was followed by most succeeding geographers. He divided the Earth into horizontal strips, called climates, between the equator and the most northerly point known to him, determined by the average length of the longest day in each. This method was very rough, but likely all Ptolemy had to depend on, as measuring angles were not readily available then. With Ptolemy, the history of geographical knowledge and discovery in the ancient world comes to a close. In this chapter, I have given a rough overview of the Greek men of science who systematically recorded the knowledge obtained by merchants, soldiers, and travelers of the extent of the world known to the ancients. Most of this knowledge was gained through military expeditions for the purpose of conquest. We must now retrace our steps and give a rough review of the various stages of conquest by which the different regions of the Old World became known to the Greeks and the Roman Empire, whose knowledge Ptolemy summarizes. Chapter 2. The Spread of Conquest in the Ancient World. In a companion volume of this series, The Story of Extinct Civilizations in the East, you will find an account of the rise and development of the various nations that held sway over the western part of Asia at the dawn of history. Modern discoveries of remarkable interest have enabled us to learn about the condition of men in Asia Minor as early as 4000 BC. All these early civilizations existed on the banks of great rivers, which made the land fertile through which they passed. We first find man conscious of himself, and putting his knowledge on record along the banks of the great rivers Nile, Euphrates, and Tigris, Ganges, and Yangtze-Kiang. But for our purposes, we are not concerned with these very early stages of history. The Egyptians got to know something of the nations that surrounded them, and so did the Assyrians. A summary of similar knowledge is contained in the list of tribes given in the 10th chapter of Genesis, which divides all mankind, as then known to the Hebrews, into descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japhet, corresponding roughly to Asia, Europe, and Africa. But in order to ascertain how the Romans obtained the mass of information which was summarized for them by Ptolemy in his great work, we have merely to concentrate our attention on the remarkable process of continuous expansion which ultimately led to the existence of the Roman Empire. All early histories of kingdoms are practically of the same type. A certain tract of country is divided up among a certain number of tribes speaking a common language, and each of these tribes is ruled by a separate chieftain. One of these tribes then becomes predominant over the rest, through the skill in war or diplomacy of one of its chiefs, and the whole of the tract of country is thus organized into one kingdom. Thus the history of England relates how the kingdom of Wessex grew into predominance over the whole of the country. That of France tells how the kings who ruled over the Isle of France spread their rule over the rest of the land. The history of Israel is mainly an account of how the tribe of Judah obtained the hegemony of the rest of the tribes. And Roman history, as its name implies, informs us how the inhabitants of a single city grew to be the masters of the whole known world. And so it was that the mighty Roman Empire came to be, but not without a long and gradual series of conquests that paved the way for their dominance. It was a process of swallowing up empire after empire, each one becoming overgrown until the Romans finally consumed them all. This expansion of power brought with it a greater understanding of the surrounding nations, and it is within our purview to recount these stages as part of the tale of geographical discovery. From a geographical perspective, the spread of knowledge can be likened to the growth of a colossal oyster shell. To begin, we must look to the north of the Persian Gulf, where the Babylonian Empire once stood. In its early stages, the kingdom of Babylon was known as Chaldea, located in the south of Mesopotamia, or the valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Over the course of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, Chaldea expanded along the Tigris Valley. However, in the 14th century BC, the Assyrians to the north, who had previously been dependent on Babylon, conquered it. After various struggles, the Assyrians established themselves throughout Mesopotamia and much of the surrounding lands. In 604 BC, the capital of this great empire was moved once more to Babylon, so that in the first and last stages it could be called Babylonia. For the sake of clarity, these 3 stages will be referred to as Chaldea, Assyria, and Babylonia. To the east, a similar process was unfolding, but in reverse. The Medes of the north developed a powerful empire in the north of Persia, which ultimately fell into the hands of Cyrus the Great in 546 BC. He then proceeded to conquer the kingdom of Lydia, located in the northwest part of Asia Minor, which had previously inherited the dominions of the Hittites. In the year 538 BC, a man by the name of Cyrus the Great conquered the empire of Babylonia, claiming the capital as his own. He expanded his rule to the borders of India and Egypt, adding the latter to the Persian Empire under his son Cambyses. The oyster shell of history had grown to encompass almost all of Western Asia. The next 2 centuries saw a magnificent struggle between the Greeks and the Persian Empire. This conflict would prove to be the most decisive in all of history, as it determined whether Europe or Asia would conquer the world. Until this point, conquest had always moved from east to west. Had Xerxes' invasion been successful, this trend would have continued. However, as an empire grows larger and includes different tribes and nations, it becomes weaker and less organized. Within a century of Cyrus the Great's death, the Greeks discovered the vulnerable point in the Persian Empire thanks to an expedition of 10,000 Greek mercenaries under Xenophon. This group had been hired by Cyrus the Younger in an attempt to capture the Persian Empire from his brother. Though Cyrus was killed in 401 BC, the 10,000, led by Xenophon, were able to hold their own against all attempts by the Persians to destroy them and eventually found their way back to Greece. Meanwhile,
Greece was consolidating as a country. From time to time, one of the tribes that made up the mountainous country gained supremacy over the others. First, it was the Athenians due to their role in repelling the Persians, then the Spartans, and finally the Thebans. However, on the northern frontiers, a group of hardy mountaineers known as the Macedonians had consolidated their power. Under the leadership of Philip of Macedon, they became masters of all of Greece. Philip had learned from the successful retreat of the 10,000 and, just before his death, was preparing to attack the great king of Persia with all the forces at his disposal, thanks to his supremacy in Greece.